No one at that feast noticed. The guests continued laughing, talking, and celebrating as if nothing had happened. The master of the feast tasted the wine and praised its quality. The bridegroom received the compliments without understanding where that drink had originated. Only 6 servants knew the truth. Only they saw the crystalline water enter the stone jars and the dark wine emerge from them. The first miracle of Jesus was not a spectacle. It was a secret. And this detail reveals something that most people have never stopped to consider. The scene took place in a small village called Cana, situated in the hills of Galilee, approximately 14 kilometers from Nazareth. It was a modest community, formed by farmers, shepherds, and artisans who lived a simple routine marked by hard work and the religious traditions inherited from their ancestors. The houses were built with local stones, the roofs covered with straw and mud, and the narrow streets meandered between centenary olive trees. In that unlikely place, far from the great centers of power, far from Jerusalem and its imposing temple, something extraordinary was about to begin. First-century Galilee was a fertile region, known for its plantations of wheat, olive trees, and vineyards. The mild climate and regular rains made the land productive. But despite this agricultural prosperity, the region was viewed with a certain contempt by the Jews of Judea. "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" Nathanael would ask shortly before meeting Jesus. This question reflected the common prejudice against the Galileans, considered less refined, less educated, and less connected to the religious elite of Jerusalem. It was precisely in this despised region that Jesus grew up. It was there that he learned the trade of a carpenter with Joseph. It was there that he lived in anonymity for approximately 30 years. And it was there that he chose to perform his first public sign. But before understanding what happened at that feast, you must comprehend what was at stake, and perhaps it is exactly this that connects that ancient story with what you experience today. Moments when everything seems to be ending, situations where shame knocks at the door, circumstances where there is no visible solution. If you have ever gone through something like this, then the story of the wedding at Cana was written for you as well. Because the same Jesus who transformed water into wine at that feast continues to act today, often in silence, often in ways that we only perceive later. And there is a depth in this passage that most people have never explored. The final words of Christ on the cross, for example, carry direct connections to this first miracle. Few people realize this. If you want to deepen your understanding of who Jesus truly is and what he accomplished, I have prepared a digital book called The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem. It reveals spiritual layers that transform the way you read the Gospels. To access it right now, it is very simple. Look, a square code is appearing on your screen. Take your cell phone, open the camera app, and point it at this code. A link will appear automatically. Just tap it, and you access the book instantly. If you prefer, the link is also in the description of this video. On a cell phone, tap the video title or the word "more" to open the description. On a computer or television, the link appears just below the video. Thousands of people are already deepening their faith through this reading. And when you access it, you are also helping to keep this channel active to continue bringing content like this. So take advantage, access the book now, and leave the word "Amen" in the comments so I know you are following this journey. Now let us return to Cana. A wedding in the first-century Jewish world was not merely a religious ceremony. It was the most important social event in the life of a family. While today celebrations usually last a few hours, in those times wedding feasts could extend for 7 consecutive days, 7 full days of uninterrupted celebration. A complete week in which the entire community participated in the festivities. Think of the logistics this required. The groom's family was responsible for the entire organization. They needed to guarantee enough food to feed dozens, sometimes hundreds of guests for an entire week. They needed to provide accommodation for visitors coming from other villages, some several days' journey away. They needed to coordinate musicians who would play during the celebrations. They needed to prepare the spaces, decorate the environments, and organize the specific religious rituals for each day. And above all, they needed to ensure that the wine did not run out at any moment. The preparation process began months before the ceremony. The groom's family needed to calculate how many guests would come, how much wine would be necessary, and how much food should be prepared. In small communities like Cana, this involved practically the entire village. Neighbors lent utensils, relatives helped in the kitchen, and friends contributed part of the supplies. Wine occupied a central place in Jewish culture. It was not just a common drink to quench thirst. It was a symbol of joy, prosperity, and divine blessing. The Psalms mention wine as a gift from God that gladdens the heart of man. The prophets used the image of the fruitful vine to describe the times of peace and abundance promised by God to his people. Wine was present in religious celebrations, in festive meals, and in moments of gratitude. At a wedding feast, wine represented all of this multiplied. It was the ultimate expression of celebration. It was the visible sign that the family had the means to honor their guests adequately. It was the public demonstration of generosity and hospitality that would define the reputation of that family for years. For this very reason, running out of wine during a wedding was considered a social catastrophe of devastating proportions. We are not talking about a simple inconvenience. We are not talking about an embarrassing situation that would be forgotten in a few days. We are talking about permanent public humiliation, a shame that could haunt that family for years, perhaps for entire generations. Neighbors would whisper in corners. Distant relatives would take the story to other villages. The name of that family would be associated with failure, with the inability to fulfill their most basic social obligations, with poverty, or with negligence. In some rabbinic traditions, the lack of wine at a wedding could even generate legal consequences. The groom could be sued by the bride's relatives for not having adequately fulfilled his responsibilities as a host. Weddings were complex social contracts, and failing in that contract brought serious implications. It was exactly this that was about to happen in Cana. The wine had run out, and no one knew what to do. The Gospel of John does not explain why the wine finished sooner than expected. Perhaps the family had miscalculated the necessary quantity. Perhaps more guests than expected had appeared, attracted by the news that Jesus of Nazareth would be present. Perhaps the financial resources were simply not sufficient to maintain the celebration for the traditional time of 7 days. Perhaps a poor harvest the previous year had made wine so expensive as to make it inaccessible in large quantities. The biblical text does not enter into these details. What we know is that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was the first to perceive the problem. This detail is significant and deserves attention. Mary was not the hostess of the feast. She was a guest like any other, but her attention to detail, her sensitivity to perceive what was happening around her, and her capacity to observe beyond the obvious allowed her to identify the crisis before it became public and irreversible. Some scholars suggest that Mary may have had some special connection with the host family. Perhaps they were relatives, perhaps they were close friends. The fact that she was so attentive to the logistics of the feast indicates that she was not an ordinary guest, but someone invested in the success of that celebration. Other commentators observe that Mary's presence in the kitchen or service areas suggests she was helping with the organization. It was common for older women to assist in community weddings, especially when they had experience in managing events of this type. Mary, as a mother of a family, certainly had this experience. And what did she do with the information about the lack of wine? She went directly to Jesus. The text records her words in a simple and direct way. They have no more wine. It was not an explicit request. It was not an order. It was not a suggestion for a solution. It was merely a statement of fact. Mary simply brought the problem to her son's attention and waited. She did not say, "Do something." She did not say, "Solve this." She did not say, "Use your power." She only presented the need. This approach reveals a profound spiritual maturity. Mary did not try to manipulate Jesus. She did not try to pressure him. She did not try to dictate how he should act. She simply brought the situation to his attention and trusted that he would know what to do. Here arises one of the most intriguing passages of the entire episode. Jesus' response seems, at first reading, distant and even sharp. He said, "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." For centuries, scholars, theologians, and commentators have debated the meaning of these words. Was Jesus refusing his mother's request? Was he being disrespectful to her? Was he establishing distance? Was he irritated by the interruption? The answer requires careful understanding of the cultural and linguistic context. The word translated as woman did not carry in first-century Greek the cold or distant connotation it may seem to have in modern languages. It was a respectful form of address, equivalent to lady or madam. It was the same word a citizen would use to address a respectable matron in the public square. Jesus would use the exact same word to address Mary when he was nailed to the cross at the moment he entrusted her to the care of the disciple John. In that context of extreme love and care, there was certainly no disrespect. The same word, therefore, could not indicate disrespect in Cana. As for the phrase, "What have I to do with thee?" it indicates a kind of separation of spheres of action. Jesus was gently signaling that from that moment on, his decisions would no longer be guided primarily by family ties, but by his divine mission. He was reminding Mary, with respect, that his ministry followed a schedule established by the Heavenly Father, not by the immediate needs that arose around him, and the mention of the hour is even deeper and loaded with theological meaning. In the Gospel of John, the hour of Jesus appears repeatedly as a reference to the culminating moment of his mission, his passion, death, and resurrection. When the Jews tried to arrest him on previous occasions, the text says that his hour was not yet come. When Jesus speaks about being glorified, he refers to the hour that was approaching. This hour was the climax of the entire history of salvation. When Jesus said that his hour had not yet come, he was indicating that the moment of the full revelation of his glory was still in the future. The signs he would perform until then would be foreshadowings, anticipations, partial glimpses of what would be fully revealed on the cross and in the empty tomb. But then, if the hour had not come, why did he perform the miracle anyway? This question leads to an important reflection on the nature of Jesus and his relationship with the Father. Jesus was not refusing to help. He was redefining the terms of the relationship and making it clear that his action would not be an automatic response to family pressures. It would be a sovereign decision, aligned with divine purposes. And even so, he chose to act. Out of compassion, out of love, out of mercy toward that family facing humiliation. Jesus' heart was moved by human need, even though his official hour had not arrived. Mary demonstrated absolute trust. Without arguing with Jesus, without debating, without trying to convince him, without expressing disappointment at the apparently negative response, she simply turned to the servants of the feast and said that phrase that would cross the centuries, "Do whatsoever he saith unto you." Mary's trust was total and unshakable. She did not know what Jesus would do. She did not know if he would do anything. She had no guarantees. She had no explicit promises. But she knew her son. She knew his heart. She knew who he was. And she knew that somehow, at some moment, by some means, he would respond. Here is a detail that often goes unnoticed in superficial readings of the text. Mary did not say to the servants, "Perhaps he will help," or "Let's see what happens," or "Stay alert in case he does something." She gave a direct, definitive, and imperative instruction. Do everything he commands. It was a declaration of absolute faith without reservations, without an alternative plan. And the servants obeyed. This is also notable and deserves reflection. Why would servants at a wedding feast obey the orders of a guest who held no position of authority there? Jesus was not the groom. He was not the father of the groom. He was not the master of the feast. He had no official function in the organization of the party. He was just one more guest among many. The text does not explain why they obeyed. Perhaps Jesus' presence had something different about it, something that inspired respect and attention. Perhaps the conviction in Mary's words was so strong, so secure, so unshakable, that it generated immediate trust in those who heard. Perhaps there was something in the atmosphere of that moment, an invisible spiritual tension indicating that something extraordinary was about to happen. What we know is that when Jesus finally gave his first instruction, the servants did not hesitate for a single instant. Nearby there were 6 large stone water jars. The Gospel specifies, with uncommon precision, that these jars were used for the Jewish rites of purification. This is not a casual detail inserted by chance into the text. It is fundamental theological information for understanding the profound meaning of the miracle. Ceremonial purification was an essential and inescapable part of Jewish religious life in the 1st century. Before entering a house, it was necessary to wash one's hands. Before participating in a meal, especially a festive meal, it was necessary to purify oneself. Before any act of worship or devotion, purification was required. The detailed prescriptions of the law of Moses specified exactly how these washings should be performed, how much water should be used, and which parts of the body should be washed. These enormous jars stood at the entrance of houses precisely for this purpose. When guests arrived for a feast, they purified themselves before entering. During the celebration, they purified themselves again before meals. It was a constant cycle of washing, purification, washing, purification. The containers were made of limestone, a specific material chosen for religious reasons. Stone, unlike ceramic, did not absorb impurities. A clay vessel that came into contact with something impure could become permanently contaminated and would need to be destroyed. Stone, on the other hand, could be washed and purified without losing its utility. Therefore, for purification rituals, stone was the preferred material. The biblical text provides precise and specific information about the size of these jars. Each of them held 2 to 3 meters. The metreta was a Greek unit of measure equivalent to approximately 39 liters. This means that each jar could store between 78 and 117 liters of water. With 6 jars, the total capacity was impressive, between 468 and 702 liters. Let us use an average estimate of 600 liters. 600 liters of stagnant water. Water destined for ceremonial purification rituals. Water that had absolutely nothing to do with wine or celebration. Water for religious cleansing, not for festive joy. And it was to these unlikely jars that Jesus pointed. Fill the water pots with water. The order seemed completely absurd, disconnected from reality, without any apparent logic. The feast was running out of wine. The hosts were on the brink of public humiliation. The crisis was imminent, and Jesus commanded them to fill purification vessels with water. What sense did that make? The servants could have questioned. They could have asked why. They could have suggested that this would solve nothing. They could have ignored the instruction of a guest without authority. But they obeyed. And they did not obey in a careless or partial manner. The text makes a point of recording, with deliberate emphasis, that they filled the jars up to the brim, to the edge, to the maximum limit, not halfway, not approximately, not more or less, completely, totally, until they overflowed. This detail matters deeply. When Jesus acts, there is no room for half measures. There is no stingy economy. There is no incomplete or partial provision. The servants filled each jar to the maximum of its capacity, leaving no empty space. Imagine the physical labor involved. 600 liters of water, probably carried from a nearby well or cistern, bucket after bucket, trip after trip. The servants must have sweated, grown tired, wondering in silence what all that meant. But they continued working until each jar was completely full. Then came the second instruction. Draw out now, and bear unto the governor of the feast. The master of the feast, or steward, was the figure responsible for supervising all the logistics of the party. It was a position of considerable authority and responsibility. He coordinated the servants, controlled the flow of food and drink, and tasted everything before serving the guests to ensure adequate quality. A kind of ancient event manager, combined with a sommelier and quality supervisor. Taking water to the master of the feast for him to taste would be the equivalent of handing a completely blank report to your most demanding boss. It made no sense. It was potentially risky. It could result in punishment for the servants, who were apparently wasting the precious time of the person responsible for the feast in a moment of crisis. The servants could have refused. They could have explained that it was only water. They could have protected their positions by avoiding appearing foolish before the master of the feast. But they obeyed anyway. And when the master of the feast brought the liquid to his lips, something completely impossible, something that defied all natural logic, had happened. The water had been transformed into wine. The text does not describe the exact moment of the transformation. We do not know if it happened while the water was still in the jars, if it occurred at the moment it was drawn out. if it took place during the journey to the master of the feast, or if the liquid was already completely transformed when the servants first took it. The Gospel simply records the final result. What entered the jars as common water came out of them as wine, and it was not just any common wine found in any tavern. The master of the feast, an experienced professional that he was, knowing absolutely nothing about where that drink had come from, was so genuinely impressed by the exceptional quality that he called the bridegroom to make a curious comment. "Every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now." This apparently casual observation reveals several important details that deserve careful analysis. First, the exceptional quality of the wine. The master of the feast was a professional with years of experience. He knew wines of all qualities. He knew how to distinguish between a common drink and a truly superior one. And what he tasted at that moment was clearly unequivocally the best wine he had tasted during that entire feast. Not just good, the best. Second, the surprising and unexpected quantity. The master of the feast naturally assumed that the groom had kept that premium wine for a special moment. This means there was enough volume to make a significant difference in the remainder of the celebration. It was not just a symbolic cup. It was not a small sample. It was abundant wine in an impressive quantity. Third, the established custom of the time that was being inverted. The normal, recognized, and expected practice was to serve the best wine at the beginning of the feast, when the guests still had a sharp palate and could fully appreciate the quality. After everyone had drunk well, when the palate was less sensitive and the capacity for distinction diminished, the inferior quality wine was served. No one would notice the difference much at that point. The groom, in the mistaken view of the master of the feast, had apparently inverted this traditional logic. He had strategically kept the best wine to serve at the end, when everyone least expected it. But the groom had kept absolutely nothing. He was as surprised as the master of the feast. He had no idea where that extraordinary wine had come from. Only the servants knew the truth, and perhaps not even they fully understood the magnitude of what they had witnessed. This is one of the most fascinating and theologically significant aspects of Jesus' first miracle. It happened almost hidden, behind the scenes, far from the spotlight. The transformation was absolutely real, concrete, verifiable, tangible. 600 liters of common water became 600 liters of the highest quality wine. But the vast majority of the people present at that feast never knew what had happened. The guests continued the celebration without realizing they had witnessed, albeit indirectly, something genuinely supernatural. The groom received effusive praise for a wine he absolutely had not provided. The master of the feast tasted an authentic miracle without having the slightest awareness that it was a miracle. Only a small, restricted group knew the complete truth. Why did Jesus choose to act in such a discreet way? Why not perform the miracle before all the guests, openly declaring his supernatural power? Why not use that strategic moment to begin his public ministry with a great spectacle that would be talked about throughout Galilee? Why not take advantage of the available audience to reveal himself as the expected Messiah? The answer perhaps lies in the very essential nature of who Jesus was and how he chose to conduct his ministry. He did not come to impress crowds with spectacular demonstrations of power. He did not come to build fame through sensationalist miracles. He did not come to compete with magicians and illusionists for popular attention. He came to serve. He came to transform. He came to solve real problems for real people, often without them even knowing he was acting on their behalf. The miracle at Cana was, before anything else, an act of pure compassion. Jesus saw a simple family about to go through a devastating humiliation that would mark them for years. He saw a young couple whose most important day of their lives was about to turn into a traumatic memory, and he acted discreetly to avoid this unnecessary pain. He did not ask for public recognition. He did not demand formal gratitude. He did not make eloquent speeches about his divine power. He simply solved the problem with silent efficiency and let the feast continue normally. This is the characteristic mark of Jesus that we often forget in our search for spectacular spiritual experiences. He acts behind the scenes when necessary. He works in silence when appropriate. He transforms impossible situations without making unnecessary noise. And often we only perceive his action when we look back, with the perspective of time, and understand that what seemed completely impossible somehow mysteriously resolved itself. And it is exactly this that this first miracle teaches us so clearly. Jesus does not wait for grand stages to act. He does not need large audiences to demonstrate his power. He is present in the most everyday situations, in moments of silent scarcity, in crises that happen far from the eyes of the world, in shames that threaten to explode when no one is watching. And when he acts, he does not offer the minimum necessary to resolve the situation. He offers overflowing abundance. He offers the best wine when any wine would have sufficed. He offers 600 liters when a single jar would have solved the immediate problem. If you want to understand more deeply how Jesus reveals his compassionate heart in the most intense moments of human existence, I have prepared the digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem. To access it now, point your cell phone camera at the square code on the screen or tap the link in the description. Your reading also helps keep this channel active, producing content. But the miracle of the wedding at Cana carries theological and spiritual meanings that go far beyond the historical event itself. The Gospel of John does not call this event a miracle in the common sense of the word. It uses another very specific Greek term, sign. The distinction between these words is theologically important and deserves careful attention. A miracle, in the popular sense of the term, is a manifestation of supernatural power that defies known natural laws. It is an extraordinary event that demonstrates capacity beyond the human. A sign is all of that, and something significantly deeper. It is a gesture loaded with meaning, which points to a greater reality, which communicates a spiritual message through a concrete and visible act. The sign is not just powerful, it is communicative. It speaks, it teaches, it reveals. And what message was being communicated in Cana through this first sign? Consider carefully the rich symbolism of the elements involved. The stone jars were not just any containers chosen at random. They were vessels specifically dedicated to the Jewish purification rituals that dominated the religious life of the time. They represented the religious system in force in Israel, a system based on minute external laws, endless repetitive ceremonies, and a constant and frustrating search for ritual purity that was never fully or permanently achieved. The water in these jars symbolized the Old Covenant established through Moses. It was useful for its specific purpose of ceremonial purification, necessary within the current religious system, but fundamentally limited in its capacity to transform. Water did not gladden hearts. It did not celebrate special occasions. It did not symbolize abundant blessing or overflowing joy. It served only for external cleansing, ritual preparation, ceremonial adequacy. And Jesus transformed this water into wine. Wine in the Hebrew scriptures and Jewish tradition represents genuine joy, authentic celebration, and the messianic blessing promised by the prophets over centuries. Prophetic texts frequently describe the era of the Messiah as a glorious time when wine would flow abundantly as a visible sign of divine presence and favor. The prophet Amos spoke of coming days when the mountains would drop sweet wine, and all the hills would melt with overflowing plenty. The prophet Isaiah described a magnificent messianic banquet with pure, refined, and aged wines, served in abundance for all peoples. The prophet Joel promised that in the days of final restoration, the mountains would drip with new wine in unimaginable quantities. By transforming water destined for ceremonial purification into wine of abundant celebration, Jesus was sending a profound and revolutionary theological message. Something radically new was beginning. The old order, based on ceremonies and external rituals, was giving way to a new transforming reality. The religious system founded on external observances was being replaced by something internal, life-giving, full of genuine joy. And it was not just a simple substitution or equivalent exchange. It was a dramatic elevation. The wine produced supernaturally by Jesus was not a common or mediocre wine. It was recognized as the best wine of the entire feast. It clearly surpassed, in the experts' evaluation, everything that had been served previously. In the same way, the new covenant that Jesus was inaugurating at that moment was not just different from the old covenant, it was superior in every aspect. It was more complete in its reach. It was deeper in its transformation. It was more glorious in its effects. There is another intriguing numerical detail that deserves attention and reflection. The text specifically mentions that there were 6 jars, not 5, not 7, exactly 6. Why this specific number? In biblical symbology developed over centuries of interpretive tradition, the number 7 consistently represents completeness, perfection, and divine fullness. It is the number of God's rest after the 6 days of creation. It is the number of days that make up a complete week. It is the number that permeates the entire structure of Hebrew thought regarding totality and conclusion. The number 6 in turn represents exactly the opposite, incompleteness. It is the number that falls one step short of perfection. It is the number of man, created on the 6th day of the creative week. It is the number that needs something additional to become truly complete. 6 purification jars symbolically represented an incomplete and insufficient religious system, a system that tried with human effort, but could not reach the fullness of communion with God, a system that desperately needed something more to become truly effective, and that something more had finally arrived in the person of Jesus. Significantly, Jesus did not add a 7th jar to complete the set and create numerical perfection. He did something much more radical and transforming. He transformed the 6 existing jars. He took the incomplete system as it was and filled it with new life. He took the limited water of ceremonial law and transformed it into the abundant wine of divine grace. The extraordinary quantity produced also carries profound theological meaning. 600 liters of premium wine. In standard modern 750 milliliter bottles, this would be equivalent to approximately 800 bottles of excellent quality. A quantity more than sufficient to generously supply an entire feast for several consecutive days, a quantity absurdly greater than what would be strictly necessary to resolve the immediate crisis of scarcity. This apparently excessive abundance is a constant and unmistakable mark of Jesus' ministry in all its manifestations. When he multiplied barley loaves and small fish to feed a crowd of 5,000 men, besides an uncounted number of women and children, he did not produce just enough to satisfy immediate hunger. 12 baskets completely full of pieces remained, which the disciples gathered afterward. When he healed 10 lepers who cried out for mercy by the wayside, the healing was not partial, gradual, or temporary. It was complete, instantaneous, and permanent, skin entirely restored in a moment. When he raised Lazarus after 4 days of death and decomposition, he did not bring him back weak, debilitated, or partially alive. Lazarus came out of the tomb on his own feet, completely restored, ready to participate in a banquet. Jesus does absolutely nothing halfway. When he decides to act, there is overflow, there is generous excess, there is much more than strictly necessary. This consistent characteristic reveals something fundamental about the very heart of God that Jesus came to manifest. The Heavenly Father is not a God of stingy scarcity or calculated economy. He is a God of overflowing abundance and infinite generosity. He is not a God who reluctantly offers the minimum necessary. He is a God who fills the jars to the maximum brim and then transforms their contents into the best wine available. He is not a God who carefully saves blessings. He is a God who pours them out generously without measure upon all those who sincerely trust in him. But the spiritual meaning of the wedding at Cana goes even deeper. The very setting chosen for the miracle, a wedding, carries immense and inescapable symbolic weight in the scriptures of Israel. Throughout the entire Old Testament, the relationship between God and his chosen people is repeatedly described in intimate matrimonial terms. God is consistently presented as the faithful husband of Israel, eternally committed to his often unfaithful bride. The prophet Hosea personally lived a symbolic and painful marriage with an unfaithful woman to dramatically represent this relationship of wounded but persistent love. The book of the prophet Ezekiel contains extensive passages describing Jerusalem as the wife of God, loved since childhood, adorned with jewels, but who prostituted herself with other lovers. The book of the Song of Songs, with its surprising erotic poetry, was interpreted by generations of rabbis and later by Christian theologians as a profound allegory of the passionate love between God and his community of faith. In the New Testament, this matrimonial image deepens and clarifies dramatically. Jesus is repeatedly identified as the heavenly bridegroom. The church, the community of the redeemed, is consistently described as his promised bride. The Apostle Paul extensively uses the metaphor of human marriage to explain the mysterious depth of the spiritual union between Christ and those who place faith in him. And the book of Revelation, the final revelation of the Christian scriptures, describes the glorious climax of all human history as a great wedding feast, the marriage supper of the Lamb, when finally Christ and his prepared bride will be eternally united in a celebration that will never end. In this broad symbolic and prophetic context, the miracle at Cana gains an extraordinary dimension. Jesus deliberately chose a wedding to perform his first public sign, not a funeral marked by sadness, not a court marked by judgment, not a battlefield marked by violence, not the temple marked by formal religiosity. A wedding, a celebration of loving union. It was as if he was silently declaring, from the very beginning of his earthly ministry, what the final and glorious objective of everything he would do would be: the definitive and permanent union between God and redeemed humanity. The eternal feast that will never know an end. The celebration that will never run out of the wine of joy. And when the master of the feast observed with admiration that the groom had strategically kept the best wine for the end of the feast, he was, completely without knowing it, prophesying about the entire history of divine salvation. God patiently kept the best for the end. Divine revelation was carefully progressive over millennia. First came the original creation of the world and humanity. Then came the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with the covenant promises. Then came the detailed law of Moses, establishing the foundations of religious life. Then came the prophets with their denunciations, their promises, and their glimpses of the future, each historical stage methodically preparing the way, each revealing phase pointing to something greater that was yet to come. And when finally the fullness of time arrived, according to the Father's perfect schedule, God sent his own Son into the world, the best wine of divine revelation, the supreme and definitive manifestation, incarnate grace that infinitely surpasses all previous blessings in history. Cana was not simply the first chronological miracle of Jesus. It was a complete and profound theological declaration, brilliantly condensed into a single transforming event. But there were specific and chosen witnesses who needed to witness it. The Gospel explicitly mentions that Jesus' disciples were present at the feast. At that initial moment of the ministry, they were still only a few men beginning an unknown journey. John and Andrew, who had previously been fervent disciples of John the Baptist, and who left their previous master to follow Jesus when John pointed to him as the Lamb of God. Peter, also called Simon, brought enthusiastically by his brother Andrew with the excited declaration that they had found the promised Messiah. Philip from Bethsaida, who responded promptly to Jesus' direct call to follow him. Nathanael, also known as Bartholomew, who initially doubted that anything good could come from Nazareth but was convinced by a supernatural demonstration of knowledge on the part of Jesus. These men were at the absolutely uncertain beginning of a journey that would completely transform their lives, and through them transform the entire world. They did not yet know exactly who Jesus truly was in all his divine fullness. They had not yet witnessed any clear and unequivocal demonstration of his supernatural power. They had only hesitantly begun to walk with him, curious about his words, hopeful regarding his promises, but still fundamentally uncertain about their destiny. What happened in Cana solidified something deep in their wavering hearts. The Gospel records that after this first sign, the disciples believed on him. This does not mean they believed in absolutely nothing before that moment. It means their incipient faith was dramatically deepened. They saw with their own eyes that they were walking beside someone genuinely extraordinary. They personally witnessed a power that clearly could not have a merely human origin. Their hopes began to gain a solid foundation. For those first followers, Cana represented transforming confirmation. It was the decisive moment when still vague expectations began to crystallize into growing certainty. It was the first concrete sign of many others that would come over the following 3 years. And there was Mary, whose presence in this episode is often underestimated or quickly passed over. It was she who sensitively perceived the problem before anyone else at the feast. It was she who had the courageous initiative to seek Jesus in search of a solution. It was she who demonstrated unshakable trust even when Jesus' initial response seemed ambiguous or even negative. It was she who decisively instructed the servants to obey without questioning. In a significant way, Mary functioned as an essential bridge between desperate human need and transforming divine action. Her simple phrase addressed to the servants became one of the most cited and meditated upon spiritual orientations of all Christian scriptures over 2 millennia. Do whatsoever he saith unto you. There is no spiritual advice simpler to formulate and at the same time deeper to live. It does not matter if you do not fully understand what Jesus is asking of you. It does not matter if the specific instruction seems strange or illogical according to human criteria. It does not matter if conventional wisdom says it will not work. Do what he commands. Fill the jars to the brim with all diligence, even if it seems a completely useless exercise. Take the liquid humbly to the master of the feast, even if it seems a completely risky undertaking for your reputation. Obey first with faith. Understand later with gratitude. This is the essential dynamic of faith that the miracle at Cana illustrates with unique clarity. The transforming miracle did not come before the servants' obedience. It came during it. The servants did not witness the water visibly transforming while it was still stationary in the jars. The transformation happened while they were faithfully obeying, while they were carrying the liquid in their vessels, while they were taking the risky step of faith. And often, it is exactly like this that Jesus chooses to act in our lives as well. He does not remove uncertainty before asking us to walk forward. He does not explain the entire plan in detail before calling us to take the first step. He simply tells us to fill the empty jars of our lives. And the miraculous transformation happens on the path of obedience. The Gospel of John carefully situates the wedding at Cana right at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, establishing its programmatic meaning. Jesus had just been solemnly baptized by John the Baptist in the historical waters of the Jordan, an event in which the Holy Spirit visibly descended upon him, and the Father's voice declared his identity as the beloved Son. He had spent 40 days in the arid desert, facing intense temptations from Satan and victoriously resisting each one. He had recently begun to gather his first disciples, calling them one by one to follow him. He was still completely unknown to the general public. He had no fame or established reputation. He had no numerous followers or organized movement. He had not performed any extraordinary public act that would attract the attention of the masses. And it was in this moment of apparent obscurity and anonymity that he chose to perform his first revealing sign. Not in Jerusalem, the religious capital where crowds gathered for the great annual feasts. Not in the sacred temple, where influential religious leaders would have been forced to pay attention. Not in Rome, the center of world political power where the empire could be impressed or confronted. In Cana, a small village without political importance, a common family feast, an extremely limited audience. This deliberate choice reveals fundamental priorities. Jesus was not interested in quickly building an impressive reputation. He was not anxiously seeking public spotlights. He was not strategically trying to maximize his influence from the beginning in a calculated way. He was simply being authentically who he was, someone who saw genuine needs and supplied them with compassion, someone who cared deeply about ordinary people in apparently insignificant everyday situations, someone whose generous compassion did not depend on audience size or potential for public impact. The first miracle of Jesus was an act of silent and discreet grace, and perhaps this is precisely the most relevant and necessary message for whoever is watching this video at this exact moment. You may be living a situation that seems completely invisible to everyone around you, a crisis that happens behind the scenes of your life, far from any observer, a silent scarcity that no one perceives or suspects, a shame that threatens to explode devastatingly at any moment. Cana proclaims that Jesus sees your situation. Cana proclaims that Jesus can and wants to act on your behalf. Cana proclaims that transformation can happen silently, without fanfare, without a public spectacle, but in an absolutely real and complete way. The guests at that feast joyfully drank wine that minutes before was common water. They did not know where that wonderful drink had come from. They did not need to know the details of the miracle. The important thing was that their cups were generously full, and so it continues to be through the centuries until today. Jesus continues filling empty cups. He continues transforming ordinary water into extraordinary wine. He continues acting graciously at feasts where joy seemed to have definitively ended. The essential question is whether we are willing to fill the jars with obedient diligence. The essential question is whether we are willing to obey before fully understanding. The essential question is whether we are willing to take the liquid to the master of the feast, even when it seems we are carrying only common water. Because it is precisely on the faithful path of obedience that the miraculous transformation happens, and it is exactly at the moment when we think everything has ended irremediably that the best wine is finally served. There is still a fascinating temporal aspect that deserves the careful attention of scholars. The Gospel of John begins its narrative with a literary structure that clearly refers back to the first chapters of the book of Genesis. The opening phrase, "In the beginning was the Word," intentionally echoes the "In the beginning God created" of the first verse of the entire Bible. And after this majestic theological introduction about the eternal nature of the divine Word, John carefully organizes the initial events of Jesus' ministry into a deliberate sequence of days. On the first day of the narrative, John the Baptist gives public testimony about Jesus to the religious leaders who came to investigate him. On the second day, Jesus is publicly pointed out as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. On the third day, Andrew and another disciple begin to follow Jesus and spend the day with him, and then the text mentions with precision, "And the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee." Adding all the days carefully, we arrive exactly at the seventh day. The transforming miracle of Cana happened on the seventh day of the Johannine narrative. This can hardly be an accidental coincidence in an author as deliberate as John. The seventh day is the day of divine rest in the original creation described in Genesis. It is the day of fullness achieved. It is the day when God solemnly declared that everything was very well made and complete. By strategically situating the first sign of Jesus precisely on the seventh day of his evangelical narrative, John is making an extraordinarily powerful theological statement. A new divine creation is beginning. A new cosmic principle is being inaugurated. Just as God completed the original creation on the seventh day and rested satisfied, now Jesus is initiating the new creation, the definitive restoration of all things corrupted by sin. And this glorious new creation begins symbolically with a transformation. Common water into excellent wine, ordinary into extraordinary, humiliating scarcity into generous abundance, imminent shame into unexpected glory. This is the transforming essence of the gospel, brilliantly condensed into a single visible act. After the miracle, the text records that Jesus, his mother Mary, his biological brothers and his disciples went down geographically to Capernaum and remained there for a few days of rest. Capernaum would become a kind of strategic operational base for Jesus' extensive ministry in the region of Galilee. It was a significantly larger city than small Cana, located on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, with important commercial activity due to the trade routes that passed through there, and an established Roman military presence that included a centurion with his garrison. But before establishing himself strategically there, before performing impressive public healings that would attract crowds, before teaching in the synagogues with authority that surprised the listeners, before confronting demonic spirits that recognized him and trembled, before challenging Pharisees and scribes with his revolutionary interpretations of the law, Jesus did something apparently simple and common. He went to a wedding feast in a small village. He celebrated joyfully with ordinary people. He discreetly avoided a devastating family shame. He silently transformed water into wine, and he began to progressively reveal who he truly was. The following 3 years of public ministry would be marked by increasingly impressive and public signs. Those blind from birth would receive sight for the first time. Paralytics carried for decades would walk instantly. Violent storms at sea would be calmed with a word of authority. Dead bodies in decomposition would rise before astonished crowds. Thousands would be miraculously fed with minimal provisions. Excluded lepers would be completely purified and restored to the community. But it all began with wine at a village feast. It all began with a common domestic problem, solved with extraordinary divine power. It all began with 600 liters of pure grace poured silently into stone jars destined for obsolete religious rituals. The Gospel of John carefully records 7 main signs of Jesus before his death and glorious resurrection. The wedding at Cana constitutes the first sign of the series. The dramatic resurrection of Lazarus constitutes the 7th and last. Between these two extremes of the narrative, there is a fascinating progression of increasing revelation. First, water transformed into wine in Cana. Second, the long-distance healing of the dying son of a royal official of the king in Capernaum. Third, the instantaneous healing of a paralytic who had waited for 38 years at the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem. Fourth, the supernatural multiplication of 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish to feed more than 5,000 hungry people. Fifth, Jesus walking supernaturally upon the agitated waters of the Sea of Galilee during a night storm. Sixth, the healing of a man born blind from the mother's womb who had never seen the light of the sun. Seventh, the resurrection of Lazarus after 4 days dead and already in advanced decomposition. Each carefully recorded sign reveals a different facet of who Jesus truly is. Each communicates something specific and complementary about his limitless power, his infinite compassion, and his absolute authority over all natural and supernatural forces. But the first sign, the wedding at Cana, definitively sets the fundamental tone for everything that will follow. Jesus radically transforms. This is the central and inescapable message. He takes what is completely empty and fills it until it overflows. He takes what is ordinary and common and makes it genuinely extraordinary. He takes what is ruined and apparently lost and restores it completely. He takes what is irremediably dead and resurrects it to new life. The transformation of water into wine is a perfect paradigm for understanding the entire redemptive work of Christ in human history, and the extraordinary abundance of the result is a glorious promise that extends through all centuries until it reaches you today. It does not matter how large your personal jars of need are. It does not matter how completely empty they seem to be at this moment. It does not matter how long the stagnant water of your life has seemed unable to gladden, unable to celebrate, unable to satisfy. Jesus can transform your situation completely. Jesus wants to transform your situation completely. Jesus is patiently waiting for you to fill your jars to the brim with obedient faith and trust the final result entirely to him. 2,000 years have passed since that memorable feast in Cana. The small village still exists on the map of modern Galilee. The ruins of the ancient constructions can still be visited by curious tourists and pilgrims. Archaeologists have identified the probable site where the historical celebration took place. Visitors from all over the world walk the same hills that Jesus traversed on that distant day. But the stone jars that held that inaugural miracle have completely disappeared into the implacable dust of time. What remains intact is something that no archaeological excavation can unearth, the silent promise of that first transforming sign. Jesus began his public ministry by transforming common water into extraordinary wine, and he ended his earthly mission by offering wine to his disciples during the solemn Last Supper, declaring that that cup represented the blood of the new covenant poured out for many. The first miracle in Cana pointed prophetically to the last sacrifice at Calvary. The theological connection is absolutely impossible to ignore. In Cana, Jesus transformed water into wine to avoid the social shame of a simple family. On the cross, Jesus poured out his own blood as sacrificial wine to permanently remove the sin that shames all humanity. In Cana, the best wine was strategically kept to be served at the end of the feast. In the complete history of salvation, the best possible gift was carefully reserved for the fullness of time. In Cana, the obedient servants filled the jars to the brim without questioning. In authentic Christian life, We are likewise called to do whatsoever he tells us, trusting that transformation will come at the right time. Perhaps you are living right now your own personal moment of painful scarcity. Perhaps the wine of your joy has apparently run out completely. Perhaps the feast of your life seems to be coming prematurely to an end. Perhaps shame is insistently knocking at the door, and you do not know absolutely how to avoid it. But that same Jesus who acted silently at a common village feast continues to act today with the same power. And when he decides to transform, he never offers the minimum necessary. He generously offers 600 liters when a jar would suffice. He offers overflowing abundance when sufficiency would be acceptable. He always offers the best wine precisely when everything seemed definitively finished. The story of the wedding at Cana is not simply about an ancient miracle recorded in dusty texts. It is about a living God who sees your real need before it becomes a public catastrophe. It is about a compassionate Savior who acts behind the scenes silently while the world continues its feast without noticing anything. It is about a firm promise that genuine transformation is available to everyone who faithfully obeys, even without fully understanding. Fill your empty jars with diligence. Trust patiently in the mysterious process. The best wine of your life is yet to come, and if you want to further deepen your transforming understanding of who Jesus truly is and what he accomplished in the final and most intense moments of his earthly life, I want to make a special invitation for you to access the digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem. This carefully prepared material will lead you through a revealing journey through the deepest declarations of Christ on the cross, revealing layers of spiritual meaning that completely transform the way you understand and live your faith daily. To access it is extremely simple and fast. Look at your screen right now. A special square code is appearing. Take your cell phone, open the camera app normally, and point the camera at this code that is on the screen. A link will automatically appear on your cell phone screen. Just tap that link once, and you will have immediate and complete access to the digital book. If you are watching on your cell phone and cannot point the camera at the screen, there is absolutely no problem. The link is also available in the description of this video. If you are watching on your cell phone, just tap the video title or the word "More" that appears just below, and the full description will open showing the link. If you are watching on a computer or television, look just below the video where the description appears. The link is there waiting for you. When you access this valuable material, besides significantly deepening your personal faith, you are also contributing to keeping this channel active and functioning, allowing more people all over the world to be reached and transformed by content like this that you have just watched. So do not leave this opportunity for later. Access the digital book right now, start your reading today, and leave the word Amen here in the comments so I know you are with me on this journey of faith and transformation.